Sometimes the greatest miracle is the one the whole world mistakes for a curse. That was the first lesson I learned before anyone ever told me my own name. Long before I understood kingdoms, dragons, or destiny, I understood fear. It lived in every cautious glance, every whispered rumor, and every silent step people took to avoid standing too close to me. They called me cursed before I was old enough to speak, and somehow that single word became heavier than any truth I could have offered. My name is Ethan Whitmore, an Omega born beneath a sky filled with strange golden lights that vanished before dawn. The elders claimed the heavens had delivered a warning. My family insisted I was simply a quiet child. The kingdom chose to believe the elders. By the time I reached 24, no festival welcomed me, no marketplace lingered when I passed, and no home invited me across its threshold. Yet no disaster had ever followed me. Crops still grew, rivers still flowed, children still laughed. The only thing my curse ever seemed capable of destroying was the chance for anyone to know me. When the royal summons arrived, nobody asked why the palace wanted an unwanted Omega. My neighbors assumed the king had finally decided to remove the kingdom's oldest source of bad luck. Even I believed that might be true. After all, kings solved problems, and people had spent my entire life insisting I was one. The journey to the capital stretched across nearly 200 miles of winding roads, rolling hills, and forests glowing beneath the warm colors of early autumn. Every mile carried me farther from the only loneliness I had ever known and closer to a future I could not imagine. The imperial palace stood above the city like something carved from sunlight itself, its white towers reflecting the evening sky while golden banners drifted gently in the breeze. Servants avoided looking directly at me. Guards remained polite but distant. Even the royal attendants lowered their voices whenever I walked by, as though speaking too loudly near me might awaken whatever terrible force they believed slept beneath my skin. No one explained why I had been brought there. No trial came. No accusation followed. Instead, I was escorted to a quiet guest chamber overlooking the palace gardens and instructed to remain inside until morning. It was the kindest imprisonment I had ever experienced. That night, unable to sleep, I opened the balcony doors and let the cool breeze. I remained perfectly still, afraid that even the smallest movement would frighten the magnificent creature resting against me. But the golden dragon only released a slow, peaceful breath that carried a faint warmth through the cool night air. Its brilliant scales shimmered beneath the moonlight like polished gold. Yet there was nothing intimidating about the way it looked at me. Instead, its calm amber eyes reflected a quiet familiarity, almost as though we had met somewhere long before either of us could remember. I had heard countless stories about the Alpha King's legendary companion. Every child in the kingdom knew the dragon accepted no touch except that of King Adrian Blackwell himself. Royal historians claimed the dragon could sense the true nature of every soul, refusing to remain beside anyone whose heart carried dishonesty or selfish ambition. If those stories were true, then nothing about this moment made sense. Before I could gather my thoughts, hurried footsteps echoed through the garden below. Lanterns flickered to life one after another as palace guards searched every pathway, calling to one another in increasingly anxious voices. Someone had realized the dragon was gone. I instinctively looked toward the open balcony, wondering if the dragon should leave before anyone discovered it here. But the enormous creature merely shifted closer and rested even more comfortably against my side, completely unconcerned by the growing commotion outside. Moments later, the chamber door opened. Several royal attendants stepped inside first, only to freeze where they stood. Their expressions changed from relief to complete disbelief in the span of a heartbeat. None of them spoke. None of them even seemed capable of breathing. Their eyes moved from the sleeping dragon to me and back again, searching desperately for an explanation that simply did not exist. Then another figure entered the room. Unlike everyone else, he did not react with panic. Tall, composed, and dressed in elegant dark royal attire embroidered with golden threads, King Adrian Blackwell carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to commanding both armies and silence. His sharp gray eyes settled on the dragon before slowly meeting mine. Neither accusation nor fear appeared in his expression. Instead, There was only careful curiosity. The room remained silent for what felt like an eternity until the king took one measured step forward. The dragon lifted its head just enough to acknowledge his presence before gently settling back into my lap, perfectly content. A faint smile touched the king's face, disappearing almost as quickly as it had appeared. I realized then that he was witnessing something no one had ever expected to see. One of the attendants finally found the courage to whisper that I must have used forbidden magic. But the king raised a single hand, ending the accusation before it could become a rumor. He continued studying both me and his companion with remarkable patience, as though solving a puzzle far older than either of us. I lowered my gaze and quietly admitted that I had done nothing at all. I had simply opened the balcony doors because I could not sleep. The dragon had come on its own, and I had been too surprised to move. The king listened without interruption. Then he asked the simplest question anyone had ever asked me since arriving at the palace. He asked whether the dragon seemed frightened when it approached me. I answered honestly that it had looked peaceful from the very beginning. The king nodded almost imperceptibly before turning toward his attendants. In a calm voice that allowed no argument, he instructed everyone to leave the chamber exactly as they had found it. No one was to disturb either the guest or the dragon until sunrise. As the doors quietly closed once more, I looked down at the sleeping creature beside me and realized that, for the first time in my life, someone had chosen to observe the truth instead of believing the fear that surrounded my name. Morning sunlight spilled across the palace gardens, painting the marble balconies with soft gold as though the night before had been nothing more than a dream. Yet when I opened my eyes, the golden dragon was still there, peacefully asleep beside me with one magnificent wing draped across the floor. For a brief moment I forgot every fearful whisper that had followed me throughout my life. The quiet warmth filling the room felt so natural that it almost convinced me I belonged there. The illusion ended the instant palace bells echoed through the capital. The dragon slowly lifted its head, stretched with graceful ease, and gazed toward the distant towers before looking back at me. It released a gentle rumbling sound that seemed strangely comforting, then lightly touched its forehead against my shoulder. I had never been close to any creature before, let alone the kingdom's most treasured guardian. Yet every movement between us felt effortless. A few moments later the dragon rose, unfolded its radiant wings, and disappeared into the bright morning sky, leaving only a few shimmering golden scales resting upon the balcony stones. Before I had time to gather my thoughts, another royal attendant arrived with a respectful bow. Unlike the others from the previous evening, he did not avoid looking at me, although uncertainty still lingered in his eyes. He informed me that His Majesty wished to share breakfast in the Eastern Garden Pavilion. I wondered whether this invitation was kindness or another examination that I would inevitably fail. The pavilion overlooked a peaceful lake where white swans drifted across calm water beneath flowering trees. King Adrian Blackwell stood alone beside a stone table, dressed far more simply than the night before. Without the ceremonial robes, he seemed less like an untouchable ruler and more like someone carrying responsibilities too heavy for a single person. He welcomed me with quiet courtesy and invited me to sit. No guards surrounded us. No advisors interrupted the silence. The only sounds came from birds singing among the branches and the gentle movement of the lake. After tea was served, the king asked me to describe every detail of the previous night exactly as I remembered it. I answered, honestly, explaining that the dragon had approached without hesitation and that I had been too surprised to do anything except remain still. I admitted that I did not understand why it trusted me because no one else ever had. The king listened carefully without speaking, studying my expression more closely than my words. When I finished, he looked toward the lake and quietly revealed something that surprised me even more. During the past 3 months, the golden dragon had grown increasingly restless. It wandered the palace after sunset, refused many meals, and often stared toward the distant mountains as though searching for something that no one could identify. The royal scholars had examined ancient records. Healers had inspected the dragon's health. Nothing explained its unusual behavior. Then, on the very first night after my arrival, it had finally slept peacefully until dawn. Neither of us spoke for several moments. The silence was not uncomfortable. It felt like standing before a locked door while both of us searched for the key. Finally, the king reached toward the center of the table and gently placed one of the shimmering scales the dragon had left behind in front of me. As soon as my fingertips brushed the golden surface, the scale released a faint warm glow that lasted only a heartbeat before fading again. Adrian did not appear frightened. Instead, his thoughtful expression grew even more serious. Somewhere within the palace walls, someone had begun spreading rumors that the cursed Omega had bewitched the sacred dragon. But sitting across from me, the Alpha King no longer seemed interested in rumors. He was beginning to search for a truth that had remained hidden long before either of us had entered this story. The palace changed long before anyone admitted it aloud. Servants who had once hurried away whenever I entered a hallway now paused just long enough to steal another curious glance. Guards still maintained respectful distance, yet their expressions no longer carried only fear. Curiosity had quietly begun replacing certainty, and I soon discovered that curiosity could spread through a kingdom much faster than kindness ever had. By sunset, whispers traveled through every corridor. Some claimed I had enchanted the sacred dragon with forgotten magic. Others insisted I must secretly belong to an ancient bloodline hidden from history itself. A few believed the dragon had merely mistaken me for someone else. None of them imagined the simplest possibility, that neither the dragon nor I understood what had happened. As evening settled over the palace, another invitation arrived from King Adrian. This time he did not ask me to meet in the gardens. Instead, I was escorted deep beneath the western wing into the royal archives, a place where centuries of knowledge rested behind towering shelves carved from pale stone. Warm lantern light filled the enormous chamber while countless leather-bound volumes lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The scent of aged parchment lingered gently in the still air. Adrian stood beside an enormous table covered with maps, journals, and handwritten records that looked older than the kingdom itself. He greeted me with the same calm courtesy as before and explained that almost every official record concerning the Golden Dragon had been preserved for hundreds of years. If there was an answer to the mystery surrounding us, he believed it might be hidden somewhere among those forgotten pages. Together we searched through accounts written by kings, scholars, explorers, and royal caretakers. Most described the dragon as a guardian of the crown, fiercely loyal and impossibly wise. But one detail appeared again and again. The dragon always chose its companions. No ruler had ever commanded its heart. Every bond had been accepted freely. That single sentence lingered in my thoughts far longer than any legend. Hours passed before Adrian carefully unfolded a fragile manuscript whose edges had faded with age. Unlike the official chronicles, this text had never been copied into newer collections. Many words had nearly disappeared, but one illustration remained beautifully preserved. It showed a radiant dragon resting peacefully beside a young figure whose face had been intentionally scratched away. Beneath the drawing, only a few readable lines survived. They spoke of a soul feared by the world yet recognized by the dragon as the keeper of forgotten light. There was no mention of curses. There was no warning. There was only a promise that truth would one day return after generations of misunderstanding. Adrian read the passage twice before quietly setting the manuscript aside. Neither of us spoke immediately. We both understood that this ancient account contradicted everything the kingdom believed about people like me. Before we could continue searching, soft footsteps echoed through the archive entrance. An elderly royal librarian approached with careful respect and bowed to the king. He hesitated before explaining that someone had requested access to every historical document concerning cursed bloodlines only hours after my arrival at the palace. The request had come from an anonymous member of the royal court, and the librarian admitted that several records were already missing from their proper shelves. Adrian's thoughtful expression became noticeably more serious, not with anger but with growing determination. If someone had begun hiding pieces of history the very night the dragon found me, then our meeting had not awakened an old curse at all. It had awakened a secret that someone had spent generations trying to keep buried. From that evening forward, the palace no longer felt like a place waiting to judge me. Instead, it became a place filled with unanswered questions. King Adrian ordered the remaining historical records to be moved into a private reading chamber where only a handful of trusted scholars could enter, and although he never explained why he allowed me to remain involved, he invited me to join every discussion. For someone who had spent an entire lifetime being excluded from nearly everything, simply being asked for my thoughts felt more unfamiliar than standing beside a legendary dragon. The days settled into a quiet rhythm. Every morning I studied forgotten journals with the king, comparing faded illustrations and incomplete maps that seemed determined to reveal only fragments of the past. Every afternoon I wandered through the palace gardens, where the silence among ancient trees somehow calmed the endless questions inside my mind. Then every evening, just as the first stars appeared above the capital, the golden dragon returned without fail. It never arrived with dramatic roars or dazzling displays. Instead, it landed softly beyond the garden walls before making its way toward me with the same peaceful confidence it had shown on the very first night. Palace servants gradually stopped running away when they saw the dragon resting nearby. They still watched from a respectful distance, but fear slowly gave way to amazement. Even the gardeners smiled quietly whenever the great creature curled beneath the flowering trees while I read aloud from the old manuscripts. Adrian often observed these evenings from the palace terrace without interrupting us. At first I assumed he simply wished to understand the dragon's unusual behavior, but over time I noticed something else. Whenever the dragon rested peacefully beside me, the king himself seemed to relax in ways that no royal ceremony ever allowed. The constant weight behind his gray eyes softened, and the careful distance he maintained around everyone else quietly disappeared. One evening he finally joined me beneath the oldest oak tree in the royal gardens. We spoke not about curses or ancient records but about ordinary memories. He admitted that becoming king at a young age had left little room for simple friendships. I confessed that I had never truly experienced friendship at all because people had always stepped away before giving me the chance. For a long moment neither of us spoke again, yet the silence between us no longer felt empty. It felt comfortable, as though we had stopped trying to solve one another and had simply begun listening. The dragon rested with its enormous head stretched across the grass between us, occasionally opening one golden eye before drifting back into peaceful sleep, almost like a quiet guardian watching over a conversation that had been waiting years to happen. Yet beyond the calm beauty of those evenings, something else continued moving unseen through the palace. Reports quietly reached Adrian that more historical records had disappeared from restricted collections. Anonymous letters warning. Officials about the cursed Omega began appearing throughout the capital. Merchants whispered that the kingdom would invite disaster if I remained inside the palace. None of the rumors contained evidence. Every one of them relied upon fear that had existed long before I was born. Adrian refused to respond publicly. Instead, he focused on finding facts rather than arguing with stories. Late one afternoon, while another search of the archives uncovered nothing new, an elderly scholar approached us carrying a small wooden case sealed with faded blue wax. He explained that the box had been hidden inside a forgotten storage room beneath the oldest library and had remained unopened for generations because no surviving record mentioned its existence. The lock had not been forced, yet as soon as I stepped closer, the ancient seal cracked quietly on its own, and before anyone could touch the lid, a gentle golden light escaped through the narrow opening, causing both the king and the dragon to turn toward the mysterious box at exactly the same moment. The faint golden light drifting from the ancient wooden box did not fill the library with brilliance. Instead, it glowed with the quiet warmth of a familiar memory, as though it had been waiting patiently through countless years for someone to finally open the forgotten lid. No one reached toward it immediately. The elderly scholar stepped back in astonishment while several royal attendants exchanged uncertain glances. King Adrian remained perfectly calm, watching both the light and my reaction rather than the box itself. I did not understand why, but the gentle glow stirred something deep within me. It was not recognition exactly. It felt more like hearing a melody I had somehow known before I was ever born. The golden dragon entered the chamber with slow, graceful steps, ignoring every person in the room until it stood beside the table. It lowered its magnificent head toward the open box and released a soft rumbling sound unlike anything I had heard before. The vibration echoed gently through the stone walls, and the golden light immediately became brighter, flowing upward in delicate strands that resembled tiny ribbons, dancing through still air. Resting inside the box was not a weapon, a royal treasure, or an ancient crown. It was a beautifully crafted journal wrapped in pale ivory cloth, accompanied by a small crystal pendant shaped like a dragon's tail. Neither object appeared remarkable until I reached toward the pendant. The moment my fingertips brushed its smooth surface, the crystal shimmered with the same warm glow as the dragon scales I had touched days before. A quiet gasp spread across the room. Even the oldest scholars admitted they had never witnessed anything like it. Adrian carefully unfolded the first page of the journal, but time had faded much of the ink beyond recognition. Only scattered sentences remained readable. One line stood out above all the others. It spoke of guardians who would one day be feared because later generations forgot the meaning of their gift. Another passage described a sacred bond that could never be forced, purchased, or inherited. It could only be recognized by the golden dragon itself. None of the surviving pages mentioned curses. None described dangerous powers. Instead, every remaining sentence carried the same quiet message. History had been rewritten by people who no longer understood the truth. As the scholars compared the fragile journal with the official royal records, troubling inconsistencies appeared almost immediately. Entire chapters from the oldest chronicles had vanished. Names had been erased. Illustrations had been replaced. The more evidence we uncovered, the more impossible it became to believe these changes were accidents. Someone had carefully reshaped the kingdom's history many generations earlier, leaving behind only enough fragments for the original story to become little more than legend. That evening, Adrian invited me to walk through the palace gardens before sunset. Neither of us spoke for several minutes as we followed winding stone paths lined with blooming flowers. Finally, he admitted that he no longer believed the kingdom had misunderstood only me. He believed it had misunderstood itself. If the ancient records were true, then fear had replaced knowledge long before either of us had been born. Quietly asked why he continued trusting me when so many voices demanded the opposite. Adrian smiled gently before answering that trust was not built from rumors. It was built from what someone consistently chose to do. He had watched the dragon become peaceful in my presence. He had watched me ask questions instead of seeking attention. Most importantly, he had watched me show kindness even after spending a lifetime receiving very little in return. Before I could respond, the golden dragon descended quietly into the garden once again. Instead of settling beside me immediately, it looked toward the distant northern mountains where the last rays of sunlight touched the horizon. Its calm expression changed for the first time since I had met it, becoming thoughtful, almost expectant, as though somewhere beyond those distant peaks another forgotten piece of the ancient story had finally begun to awaken. The following morning, the distant northern mountains remained visible from the highest palace terrace, their snow-covered peaks glowing beneath the first light of dawn, as though they were reflecting something brighter than the rising sun itself. I could not explain why I kept looking toward them. Ever since the golden dragon had fixed its attention on that horizon, a quiet feeling had settled inside me, neither fear nor excitement, but the unmistakable sense that an answer had finally begun moving toward us. King Adrian noticed my silence during breakfast, yet instead of asking questions, he invited me to accompany him to the royal observatory where the oldest celestial maps and geographic records of the kingdom had been preserved. Unlike the grand archives below the palace, the observatory felt almost forgotten. Dust rested upon polished brass instruments, faded constellations stretched across the painted ceiling, and enormous windows overlooked every direction of the empire. An elderly astronomer welcomed the king before carefully unlocking a cabinet that had not been opened for decades. Inside rested several ancient star charts alongside a remarkably detailed map of the northern frontier. As Adrian compared the map with the fragmented journal we had discovered, the elderly scholar quietly pointed toward a valley hidden deep within the mountains. According to one surviving record, that remote place had once been known as the sanctuary of the first guardian. The name appeared nowhere in modern history books. It had vanished just like so many other pieces of the forgotten past. The scholar admitted that most people dismissed the sanctuary as nothing more than a legend because no official expedition had ever returned with proof of its existence. Yet the oldest map marked its location with the same dragon-shaped symbol engraved upon the crystal pendant now resting safely inside my pocket. Neither Adrian nor I spoke immediately. We simply exchanged a glance that needed no explanation. Every discovery continued leading toward the same forgotten truth. Later that afternoon, while we walked through the palace gardens once again, the golden dragon landed beside the reflecting pool and watched us with quiet patience. Adrian carefully removed the crystal pendant from its protective case and placed it into my hands. The instant my fingers closed around it, the pendant released a gentle golden glow that spread across its surface in delicate lines, resembling tiny branches of light. To my amazement, matching patterns appeared along several of the dragon's brilliant scales before fading just as quickly as they had arrived. The connection lasted only seconds, but everyone present witnessed it clearly. None of the royal attendants reacted with panic anymore. Instead, they watched with growing wonder, as though each passing day made the impossible feel a little more natural. That evening Adrian finally shared something he had kept to himself. As a child, he had often heard his grandfather speak about an old promise passed from ruler to ruler, one that had never been written into official law. The promise claimed that when the kingdom forgot the meaning of compassion, the golden dragon would eventually guide its true guardian back into the light. His grandfather had always believed it was simply a bedtime story meant to remind future kings to rule with kindness. Now Adrian was no longer certain it had been a story at all. As night settled over the palace, the dragon once again rested peacefully beside me beneath the stars while the king quietly remained nearby. Looking toward the distant northern mountains, I realized that whatever awaited us, there was no longer just the answer to my own past. It might reveal the forgotten beginning of the dragon's bond with the kingdom itself, and somewhere beyond those silent peaks, it felt as though someone had been waiting for our arrival for a very long time. Preparations for the journey began before sunrise, yet an unusual calm settled over the palace instead of excitement. Only a small group knew where we intended to travel. King Adrian insisted that the expedition remain quiet until we understood what truly waited beyond the northern mountains. The elderly astronomer carefully copied the ancient map by hand, while the royal librarian wrapped the fragile journal inside protective cloth, designed to preserve fading pages from wind and moisture. Every detail suggested that this was not merely another royal expedition. It felt like the reopening of a chapter history had tried to erase. Before our departure, Adrian invited me to the highest balcony overlooking the capital. Thousands of rooftops stretched toward the horizon, glowing beneath the gentle colors of early morning. He admitted that the kingdom below had trusted stories for generations without ever asking whether those stories were true. If the forgotten sanctuary existed, everything people believed about the dragon, the guardians, and even the meaning of my so-called curse might change forever. I quietly asked whether he worried the truth would be rejected even if we found it. Adrian smiled thoughtfully before answering that truth often arrived long before people were ready to accept it, but that had never made it any less real. As the first rays of sunlight reached the palace gates, the golden dragon descended into the courtyard with graceful confidence. Instead of waiting near the royal stables as everyone expected, it walked directly toward me and lowered its head until our eyes met once again. The crystal pendant resting beneath my cloak immediately released its familiar golden glow, brighter than ever before. Delicate streams of warm light spread across the dragon's shimmering scales, creating elegant patterns that looked remarkably similar to the symbols decorating the oldest pages of the forgotten journal. The scholars watched in complete silence. None of them attempted to explain what they witnessed because no explanation yet existed. Our journey north carried us through quiet villages, wide meadows, and forests untouched by time. The farther we traveled, the stranger the pendant became. During the day it remained still, but every evening its gentle light pointed unmistakably toward the distant mountains as though acting as a silent guide. The golden dragon never flew far ahead. Instead, it remained close to our small group, occasionally looking back to make certain we continued following. Several days later, we reached the foothills where ancient stone markers emerged beside the old mountain road. Time had worn away most of their carvings. Yet one symbol remained perfectly clear on every weathered pillar. It matched the dragon-shaped emblem from the hidden map and the glowing pattern inside the crystal pendant. The elderly scholar whispered that no official records had ever mentioned these monuments. Somehow an entire road leading toward the sanctuary had disappeared from history while remaining physically untouched by time itself. As twilight settled across the valley, we rounded one final bend in the mountain path and suddenly the landscape opened before us. Beyond a field of wildflowers stood enormous white ruins resting peacefully beneath towering cliffs. Elegant columns reached toward the evening sky, their surfaces covered with golden vines that seemed to shimmer without sunlight. At the center of the forgotten sanctuary stood a circular stone platform unlike anything I had ever seen. The instant I stepped onto its smooth surface, the pendant floated gently upward from my hands, surrounded by soft golden light. At the same moment, the golden dragon released a deep, joyful rumble that echoed through the silent valley, and one by one, ancient symbols hidden across every column awakened together, illuminating the sanctuary as though it had been patiently waiting through countless generations for its true guardian to finally come home. Golden light continued flowing across the ancient sanctuary until every carved symbol shimmered with quiet brilliance, revealing details that centuries of darkness had carefully hidden rather than erased. None of the stone walls had been damaged. None of the inscriptions had been destroyed. They had simply remained invisible, waiting for the moment when the guardian recognized by the golden dragon would finally return. The crystal pendant floated gently above the circular platform before descending into a small stone pedestal at its center, as though it had always belonged there. The instant it settled into place, delicate lines of light spread outward across the floor, connecting every column in a graceful pattern that resembled the wings of a dragon embracing the entire sanctuary. The elderly scholars watched with tears in their eyes as faded words slowly appeared along the polished stone. Adrian stepped beside me, reading the restored inscription aloud. It declared that the guardians were never chosen to command dragons, but to remind kingdoms that compassion could protect what fear never could. Those blessed with the ancient bond would often be misunderstood because people found fear easier to preserve than kindness. The final lines explained the truth that history had buried for generations. There had never been a curse. The mark carried by each guardian was a promise mark, a symbol recognized only by the golden dragon when the kingdom needed guidance more than power. Every rumor, every warning, and every accusation that had followed my family through the years had grown from forgotten stories repeated until they replaced the truth itself. I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering every frightened face from my childhood, every empty street, every door quietly closed before I could reach it. For years I believed there had been something wrong with me. Standing inside the sanctuary, I finally understood that nothing had ever been broken except the memories of those who came before us. The golden dragon approached and gently rested its head against my shoulder exactly as it had on the very first night at the palace. This time I understood why. It had never been rescuing me from loneliness. It had been welcoming home the companion its kind had promised to recognize across generations. Adrian smiled with unmistakable relief, not because another mystery had been solved, but because the truth had proven far gentler than the fear surrounding it. When our expedition returned to the capital several days later, the restored manuscripts, the recovered inscriptions, and the scholars' careful records were presented before the royal council and then shared throughout the kingdom. Some people accepted the truth immediately. Others needed time to let go of beliefs carried for an entire lifetime. Adrian never forced anyone to change their minds. Instead, he allowed the restored history to speak for itself, trusting that honesty would travel farther than fear ever could. As the seasons passed, the whispers that once followed my name slowly disappeared, replaced by quiet conversations about the forgotten guardians and the promise they represented. Children who had once hidden behind their parents now smiled when they saw me walking through the palace gardens. Scholars reopened abandoned libraries. Artists painted the sanctuary once more. The golden dragon continued returning every evening, crossing the peaceful gardens with familiar confidence before settling comfortably beside me beneath the stars. Sometimes Adrian joined us after the responsibilities of the day had ended, and the three of us would simply watch the night sky in comfortable silence. Looking across the quiet kingdom, I realized that the greatest miracle had never been the dragon choosing me. The true miracle was discovering that one forgotten act of trust could restore an entire history, heal generations of misunderstanding, and remind a kingdom that the brightest blessings are often hidden inside the stories the world fears most until someone finally has the courage to remember the truth.